In the smoky Hamburg clubs of the early 60s, four Liverpool lads called the Beatles simply wanted to play American rhythm and blues. 6 years later, their spark drew more than 400,000 people to a rain-soaked dairy farm in upstate New York for Woodstock. How did four ordinary boys change the weather of the human soul?
Welcome to Top Spot 40 Music Docuseries, where we bring the stories behind the music to life.
The Swinging Sixties picture, a gray city waking up to color. London in the early 1960s still carried the soot of war on its shoulders, but something electric was stirring in the coffee bars and basement clubs. Young people who had grown up on ration books and their parents' memories of the Blitz suddenly found themselves with a few shillings in their pockets, a transistor radio in their hands, and a burning desire to make noise. That noise would soon be heard around the world. It started, as so many British revolutions do, in the north. In Liverpool, four lads who called themselves the Beatles were learning their craft in smoky clubs and on the rough stages of Hamburg. John, Paul, George, and Ringo didn't set out to change civilization. They simply wanted to play the American rhythm and blues records they loved. But when they returned home and began writing their own songs, something shifted. Love Me Do in 1962 was pleasant enough, yet it was the cry of She Loves You the following year that cracked open the decade. The hair was longer, the suit sharper, the harmonies tighter than anything teenagers had heard before. Beatlemania wasn't a marketing campaign. It was a genuine eruption of joy. Girls screamed until they fainted. Boys grew their hair and argued with their fathers. And across the Atlantic, America, still mourning its young president, found itself smiling again. The British invasion had begun. The Rolling Stones came roaring behind the Beatles like a blues train that had jumped the tracks. While the Fab Four sang about holding hands, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards snarled about time being on their side and not getting any satisfaction. The contrast was perfect. The 60s would never be just one thing. It would be harmony and rebellion living in the same breath. The Animals gave us the haunting House of the Rising Sun. The Kinks turned everyday English life into wry pop art with Well-Respected Man and Waterloo Sunset. The Who smashed guitars and sang about teenage frustrations so convincingly that Pete Townsend seemed to be channeling an entire generation's restlessness. Back in America, the response was magnificent. In Detroit, Berry Gordy had built a factory of sound called Motown. The Supremes in their elegant gowns, the Temptations with their razor-sharp choreography, and the Four Tops pouring out soulful longing proved that black artists could cross over to white audiences without softening their brilliance. Baby Love, My Girl, Reach Out, I'll Be There. These records didn't just play on the radio. They became the soundtrack of young love in suburban bedrooms and inner-city street corners alike. Meanwhile, in California, the Beach Boys turned surfing into poetry. Brian Wilson's productions grew more and more ambitious until Good Vibrations sounded like pocket symphonies beamed in from some sun-drenched future. Yet the decade refused to stay sunny. In Greenwich Village, a young man from Minnesota named Bob Dylan was rewriting the rules. He arrived looking like a scruffy Woody Guthrie and proceeded to turn folk music into a weapon of conscience. Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin' became anthems for the civil rights movement. When Dylan plugged in his electric guitar at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, half the audience booed and the other half cheered. That single moment cracked folk music wide open and helped birth folk rock. The Byrds took Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man and gave it wings. Simon and Garfunkel added their exquisite harmonies to a generation's growing unease about Vietnam. The center of the 60s kept shifting. By 1966, it had moved to Los Angeles, then to San Francisco. In Haight-Ashbury, young people talked about peace, love, and expanding their minds. The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and Big Brother and the Holding Company created a sound that seemed to swirl and breathe like the psychedelic posters on the walls. Jimi Hendrix arrived from England like a comet. An American who had to cross the ocean to be discovered, he played the guitar with his teeth behind his back and sometimes set it on fire. His performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock would become one of the most powerful musical statements of the entire era, a distorted, crying, beautiful reinterpretation of the national anthem that asked hard questions about what America was becoming. 1967 was the summer when everything seemed possible. The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album so inventive that it felt like the whole culture had taken a deep breath and decided to dream in Technicolor. The Monterey Pop Festival that same summer introduced Otis Redding to a massive white audience, gave Hendrix his American breakthrough, and showed that music could be both a business and a spiritual gathering. Scott McKenzie sang San Francisco, and flowers appeared in thousands of young people's hair. For one brief shining season, it seemed as though love really might conquer all. Of course, it couldn't. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy in 1968 shook the nation's faith. The war in Vietnam dragged on, filling living rooms with images no one could unsee. Music responded with both rage and tenderness. Creedence Clearwater Revival captured the working man's frustration. Janis Joplin sang like her heart was breaking in real time. Marvin Gaye asked, "What's going on?" and somehow made the question itself sound like prayer. Then came Woodstock in August of 1969. For 3 days, more than 400,000 young people gathered on a dairy farm in upstate New York. It rained, the roads collapsed, food and water ran short, and yet the music played on. Richie Havens opened the festival with a raw improvised freedom. Joan Baez sang in the dark. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young performed songs so new the ink was barely dry. Jimi Hendrix closed the event at dawn on Monday morning, playing to a sea of mud and sleeping bags. Many who were there later said the weather, the shortages, and the sheer size of the crowd turned what could have been chaos into a miracle of cooperation. For one weekend, the dream felt real. The 60s did not end neatly on December 31st, 1969. Some say they truly closed at the disaster of Altamont later that year, when a free Rolling Stones concert descended into violence. Others believe the decade kept swinging until the last American helicopter left Saigon. But the music had already done its work. It had pried open minds, challenged old rules about race and class and sex, and given young people a voice louder than any previous generation had dared to use. Look back now with the gentle eyes of time. Those vivid album covers, those scratchy 45s, those voices that once poured from car radios on warm summer nights, they still speak. The girl groups taught us about longing. The British bands taught us about swagger. Motown taught us about grace under pressure. Dylan taught us to question. The psychedelic explorers taught us that beauty can be found in unexpected places. And the Beatles, well, they simply taught us that 4 ordinary boys with extraordinary talent could remind the world how good it feels to sing together. The fashions have changed. The hairstyles look dated in old photographs. But the spirit of the swinging 60s refuses to fade. Every time a young band picks up guitars and writes songs about hope and justice, every time someone falls in love to a Motown record, every time an aging voice sings along with Hey Jude in a supermarket aisle, the 60s swing on. Because in the end, that decade taught us a simple, lasting truth. Music doesn't just reflect its time. Sometimes, if the moment is right and the hearts are open, music can actually change the weather of the human soul. And for a few unforgettable years, the weather was glorious.
Thank you for joining us for Top Spot 40 Music Docuseries. Discover all the stories behind the music at topspot40.com. Until next time, keep the music playing.